everyone. Hi friends, welcome back again. I am Ruth Warren and this is series we are exploring important topics in forensic psychology. In the previous lesson, we began discussing child custody and parenting evaluations based on Chapter 6 by Philip M. Stahl. We talk about why courts ask psychologists to evaluate families when parents separate or divorce and how psychologists help the court understand the psychological needs of children. But today, I want to bring you deeper into the reality of these evaluations. Because when psychologists enter a custody dispute, they are not stepping into a calm situation. They are often entering a space filled with conflict, with pain, accusation, and sometimes fear. So the question becomes very important. How does psychologists remain ethical, objective, and responsible while working in the middle of that conflict? That is what we will explore today. So stay tuned and we are going to continue to next slide. Let me invite you to imagine a real situation. Two parents are separating after many years of marriage. The relationship has broken down and the communication between them has become very difficult. Each parent believes they are the one who understands the child best. Each parent believes the child should live primarily with them. Now imagine the child in the middle of this situation. The child may feel confused. The child may love both parents. And sometimes the child may feel pressure to choose sides. So when the courts ask a psychologist to conduct a custody evaluation, the psychologist is entering this emotional environment. This is why ethical responsibility becomes so important. Because the psychologist's words and conclusion may influence decisions that shape the child's life for many years. Now, let me ask you a question. When psychologists conduct custody evaluation, who are they really working for? Are they working for the mother or are they working for the father? The answer is no. They are not working either for mother or for father. The psychologist's responsibility is to advocate for one parent over another. So the psychologist's responsibility is to provide objective professional insight to the court, always with attention to the well-being of the child. So this requires a strong ethical foundation. Professional guidelines from psychological organizations emphasize that evaluators must remain neutral, avoid bias, and ensure that their conclusions are based on careful evidence and professional judgment. In other words, the evaluator must become a careful observer of family dynamics rather than participants in the conflict. Now, my friends, imagine another situation. Suppose a psychologist understands clinical therapy very well but has never studied family conflict during divorce. Would that psychologist be prepared to evaluate a custody dispute? Probably not. Custody evaluations require specialized knowledge in several areas. And the evaluator must understand child development because the emotional needs of a 6-year-old child are very different from those of a teenager. The evaluator must also understand how divorce affects children emotionally and how parental conflict may influence a child's behavior. So, without this specialized knowledge, it would be very difficult for the evaluator to interpret what is happening in the family. And this is why professional guidelines emphasize that psychologists must develop specific expertise before conducting custody evaluations. Now, my friends, imagine another situation. Suppose a psychologist understands clinical therapy very well but has never studied family conflict during divorce. Would the psychologist be prepared to evaluate a custody dispute? Probably not. Custody evaluation requires specialized knowledge in several areas. The evaluator must understand child development because the emotional needs of a 6-year-old child are very different from those of a teenager. And the evaluator must also understand how divorce affects children emotionally and how parental conflict may influence a child's behavior. So, without this specialized knowledge, it would be very difficult for the evaluator to interpret what is happening in the family. And this is why professional guidelines emphasize that psychologists must develop specific expertise before conducting custody evaluations. Up to this point, we have been discussing custody evaluations in general terms. But in many cases, real cases, the situation becomes more complicated. Some custody disputes involve serious allegations such as domestic violence or child abuse. Other cases involve a child who refuses to see one parent. In some families, the conflict between parents becomes so intense that every conversation turns into a dispute. For psychologists conducting evaluations, this situation requires careful attention and thoughtful investigation. Because what appears on the surface may not always represent the full reality of the family situation. Let us consider domestic violence. Research has shown that violence may appear in some divorcing families, but it does not always look the same in every situation. Sometimes violence occurs during moments of intense conflict, and in other cases, violence may be part of a pattern of control and intimidation within the relationship. So for custody evaluators, understanding these patterns is essential because the court must consider not only the rights of the parents but also the safety and psychological well-being of the child. So the evaluator must carefully examine the evidence, listen to the different perspectives, and remain attentive to the possibility of risk within the family environment. Another complex issue in custody evaluations involves situations where a child strongly rejects one parent. Sometimes this happens because the child has been influenced by negative messages from the other parent. This phenomenon is often referred to as parental alienation. However, psychologists must be very careful in interpreting these situations because sometimes a child avoids a parent for legitimate reasons such as fear or previous negative experiences. So, the evaluator must ask careful questions. Is the child rejecting the parent because of influence from the other parent? Or is the child responding to genuine emotional experiences? These distinctions require thoughtful investigation and professional judgment. So, my friends, as we come to the end of these lessons, we begin to see something very important. Child custody evaluations are not simply technical procedures. They involve human relationship, emotional pain, and sometimes very serious allegations. So, forensic psychologists working in this field must remain thoughtful, ethical, and deeply attentive to the needs of children. In our next video, we will continue this discussion by looking more closely at how custody evaluations are actually conducted, including the steps psychologists take to gather information and prepare reports for the courts. Thank you for learning with me today, and I will see you in the next video. Don't forget to subscribe and follow me. Thank you. Bye-bye. Ciao, ciao.